Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about deficit deadlifts. And this is a tool uh, I'm a big fan of. I've used these for a long time. I program them for a lot of my lifters. A lot of my people max on them. A lot of my people do speed work on them. A lot of them do rep work on them. You guys have seen me do all three over the years. And I think they're one of the best tools for building a deadlift. And I'll go so far as to say that you can use them as your primary form of deadlift training. And I know a lot of other coaches who feel the same way. Now, you see people who talk about them like, oh, they're dangerous for your back. Oh, things can go wrong. But really, they aren't. They're not putting you in any sort of unnatural position. And if you have a strong back and a strong core, it really isn't problematic. You know, as long as you're staying within your limits, you're not grinding crazy reps and things. It's really not a concern. And I'll give some examples of people I know and have had conversations with who are fans of it. I've seen Chris Duffin promote doing these almost all the way up to meet, you know, because he's like, look, if I can pull it on a 1-inch deficit, I can have a bad day at meet and know for a fact I'm going to pull it. And I saw him write that many, many years ago. I've talked with Tom Martin about it in the past, and again, he broke an all-time open age class world record in the deadlift for his weight class, right? So he's a guy who knows a lot about deadlift training and using the deadlift. Even some people who some of you may or may not even like. I've seen guys like Dr. Mike Israetel point out that when he discusses stimulus to fatigue, he's like, a deficit deadlift's better than a conventional deadlift for the purpose of using it for hypertrophy. And that's kind of where I want to go with it. And that's one of the reasons I'm a fan of it. The stimulus to fatigue, it forces us to use a lighter weight, but we get into more lengthened positions. In other words, a lighter weight will actually, for some of the muscles involved, will give us more mechanical tension. Okay, and that's what we're looking for. It's what are the things that we talk about a lot. Lengthened positions. What does that mean in layman's terms, right? For people who don't look at exercise science, stretching a muscle. In other words, getting a stretch on movements, on your lifting doesn't mean just, stretching yourself out. I'm talking about under load, under weight when we're doing exercises. A longer range of motion on an exercise that puts us into a stretch tends to cause more muscle growth. It has more potential for it. Right? One of the biggest complaints with the deadlift, even though deadlift in the only hypertrophy study that's really looked at it, did phenomenally well, by the way. Did phenomenally well, but a lot of people will argue that the deadlift isn't that great for putting on size because, there's so much fatigue created. Now it's a partial. Well, this removes some of the partial of it because you can make it a longer range of motion exercise. And we understand most movements are to some degree a partial. Unless they put you into a really serious stretch, they probably are a partial. That's okay. But we can take a movement like this that brings a lot to the table, and we can add range of motion into those lengthened positions by going into a deficit. All right, so again, what does that do? Makes, for someone like me, makes 500 pounds feel pretty heavy, right? I'm doing, I think, that 1-inch deficit with 515 per work sets. I'm doing that 2.5-inch with 500 pounds. And you know what? For me, that's heavy. I mean, granted, I've pulled like 560, 570 from that 2.5-inch before for a max, but for rep work, I mean, those are heavy reps. Every single one of those is challenging. Every single one of those has a growth stimulus. Okay, I don't have to put 550 on the bar. I have to go up really heavy. I can work with 500 pounds and get a great training response on rep work. Okay, I'm reducing the amount of axial loading, amount of compression in my spine. I'm working muscles through a longer range of motion. Okay, we can get some good size out of this while still getting the performance carryover to a deadlift. It'll still train your normal deadlift. Okay, but it also helps with rate of force production. That's a couple things that need to be noted here. Because of the longer pull and pulling from that position, it really forces you to have to sustain the force production longer. Okay? And this is what I've seen Tom Martin point out with this, is that it's great for fixing your lockout. Now, there's people all the time who are like, no, it's great for getting you stronger off the floor. To some extent, but I think where it really shines is the ability to lock. Why? The pull is longer. It takes you longer to complete it. You're used to straining for a longer time. Especially when we get to those final reps. If you get to a rep that slows down a little bit, right, that carries over really well to a max when you have to grind through, when you're really slowing up at the knee, right, and you're just having to get that follow through. The carryover is great. All right. What about the grip end? I find it's harder on the grip, and I think that also comes down to that longer pull. We're having to pull dynamically for a longer time. It's harder. It feels harder on the grip, and that's one of the things I've always noticed with the deficit pulls. It feels more difficult to grip it, particularly in the later reps, and I do believe it's due to that longer pull time. Okay, that longer pull time. You know, it just, again, grip has a endurance component to it, even when we're pulling for maxes, right? Because it's a static hold. But again, that longer sustained rate of force production seems to carry over to grip really well. So when we start adding all this stuff up, this exercise makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. More muscle, better grip strength, less fatigue, slightly easier to recover from. Now granted, are those huge differences? No. They're fairly minor, but they are there. But that's the thing, if we're chasing certain benefits in training, we should be looking at those small benefits. Now, people who will talk about the injury risk, I don't think that's really there. The same people who are telling you it's the injury risk are because, well, the background's more. But we don't have evidence that a rounded back at the start is associated with disc injuries at all. In fact, the scientific literature says the opposite. It says if you start with a rounded back and you're used to doing it, there is no danger of any additional danger of back injury. That's what the research is showing. It's only people who lose their positioning during the pull, right? So in other words, you have a fairly flat back and then it rounds after you start lifting it, right? That's where you run into a problem. But this forces you to be slightly more rounded on the floor. Well, that's the safe spot to do it from. So I don't believe that the concerns of injury risks are legitimate. I just don't. There's no evidence for it. It's based upon an outdated theory. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.